and that hurted him when she left him. He would go to the swimming pool. I go set the pool up for him so he could lay out by the pool.
3 weeks before she passed away, Nancy Rooks asked her family for just one thing. She wanted someone to write down what she was about to say, word for word, because she didn't trust her own memory to hold on much longer, and she needed someone else to carry it once she was gone. What she dictated that day was never meant for cameras or interviews. It was meant to outlive her. And buried inside those handwritten pages was a single sentence about Elvis Presley's final hours that contradicts almost everything we have been told for the last 45 years. Not a wild theory. Not a tabloid headline. The quiet, careful words of a woman who spent 10 years standing close enough to touch history, and who waited until there was almost no time left to finally tell the truth. By the end of this, you will understand why so many longtime fans say this single story changed the way they see Elvis Presley's death completely. Let's start with something most people don't know at all. Nancy Rooks almost never worked at Graceland. She wasn't searching for the job. She wasn't connected to anyone famous. She was simply filling in for a few weeks while another staff member recovered from an illness, a temporary placement through an agency, nothing more than that. But something about her caught the attention of the family almost immediately. She didn't get starstruck. She didn't try to insert herself into conversations that weren't hers. She simply worked, quietly and completely, and within a short time, what was supposed to be a brief stand-in job turned into 10 full years inside one of the most private homes in America. Her responsibilities grew quickly. She wasn't just cleaning anymore. She became the person responsible for cooking Elvis's favorite meals late into the night, the comfort food from his childhood, peanut butter and banana sandwiches, fried specialties, the kind of food that reminded him of who he was before the world ever knew his name. And here's something that almost never gets explained properly. Elvis didn't operate on a normal day. His entire life ran backwards. He slept while the sun was up and came alive once the rest of the world had already gone to bed. So Nancy's schedule rearranged itself entirely around his hours, beginning her shift in the evening and not finishing until well past midnight, sometimes much later than that. That's when she would see the version of him almost nobody else ever witnessed. Barefoot. Quiet. Sometimes laughing about something small, other times completely silent, somewhere deep inside his own head. She learned, faster than most, the difference between the nights he wanted someone nearby and the nights he simply needed to be left alone. And that quiet understanding may be exactly why, out of everyone working in that enormous house, he trusted her the way he rarely trusted anyone. She watched the constant flow of people moving through those doors for 10 straight years, friends, bodyguards, business partners, people who always seemed to need something from him. She saw how much weight rested on one single man's shoulders. But she also saw what happened after everyone left, when the house finally went quiet and his exhaustion became impossible to hide. She never sold those memories. While other people connected to him profited from stories for decades, she stayed mostly silent. When fans wrote asking what he was really like, her answers were brief but warm. He was kind. He was funny. He was generous. That was usually the extent of it. But here is the part of her story almost nobody focuses on. Even in the books she eventually wrote, even in the handful of interviews she gave over the years, she was still holding something back. Not exaggeration. The opposite. She held back the details that felt too complicated, too heavy to explain properly, things that didn't fit the warm, simple version of Elvis that fans wanted to read about. So what was she protecting for nearly 5 decades? And why did she finally decide, near the very end of her own life, to let a small piece of it go? To understand that, you have to understand exactly what the summer of 1977 actually felt like inside that house, because the popular version of this story leaves out almost everything that made those final weeks so strange. The energy inside Graceland had noticeably shifted by that summer. Heavier. Thinner somehow, even during the nights when music still played and laughter still echoed down the hallways. Elvis had changed physically. He had grown heavier, slower, visibly uncomfortable at times. But here is the detail that almost every retelling of his death conveniently leaves out. He wasn't giving up. He still had tour dates scheduled. He was actively preparing to get back out on the road. A man who has truly surrendered to the end doesn't keep making plans for a future he doesn't expect to see. Nancy noticed details that almost no one else caught. The way he lowered himself into chairs more carefully than before. The way his appetite would disappear for days and then suddenly return. The upstairs bathroom had quietly become something close to his personal sanctuary, a space the staff understood instinctively not to disturb. And his sleep, already unconventional for years, had become even more unpredictable in those final weeks. He could be joking warmly with a friend one moment, completely present, and pacing the hallways alone the next, lost somewhere deep inside his own thoughts, as if something invisible kept pulling at him. The day before he died, he played racquetball at the court behind the house, a detail repeated in nearly every documentary ever made about him, almost to the point of losing all meaning. But what rarely gets emphasized properly is just how ordinary that entire day felt to the people who were actually inside the house with him. He wasn't bedridden. He wasn't visibly fading. He was up, moving, sweating, laughing with the people around him in the kitchen afterward. Nothing about that day looked like the day before an ending. And that single fact is exactly why what happened next devastated everyone who witnessed it. Nancy remembered the early hours of that final morning with painful clarity, even decades later. He had just returned from playing racquetball, standing near the kitchen steps, tired but completely alert, fully himself in every visible way. She offered him food, the way she always did every single night. He shook his head and said he didn't want anything to eat, only sleep. But there was one thing he asked for. Water. So water was brought to him in a plastic pitcher, the kind normally used for orange juice. And here is the detail that has quietly haunted everyone who witnessed it for the rest of their lives. He didn't sip that water calmly. He drank it fast, almost desperately, like someone who hadn't had a single drop in days. At the time, nobody thought much of it at all. He's just hot from playing ball, Nancy remembered telling herself in the moment. It felt like such a small, forgettable detail. But decades later, that single image refuses to fade from her memory. A tired man gulping water like his entire body was begging for it, and then walking upstairs for what would become the very last time anyone ever saw him alive. He didn't say anything dramatic. He didn't deliver some kind of farewell speech. He simply wanted water, and then he wanted sleep. Later that same morning, he was found unresponsive, and within minutes, the house that had felt so calm only hours earlier erupted into complete chaos. Paramedics rushing through hallways, panic spreading from room to room, a moment that would dominate headlines for the next 45 years. But for Nancy, the loudest sound she carried in her memory was never any part of that chaos. It was the quiet echo of one small, ordinary request, the very last thing she ever did for a man she had cared for so deeply over an entire decade of her life. This is usually where most versions of this story end completely. But Nancy's story didn't end there, because what she carried silently for the next 45 years wasn't simply grief. It was a persistent, nagging feeling that the official story everyone accepted as complete fact was somehow missing something essential. She rarely discussed it publicly. She gave a small handful of interviews across the decades and wrote a couple of books, but even then, she remained extremely careful, never sensationalizing anything, never turning him into either a saint or a cautionary tale for other people's entertainment. She maintained a clear, deliberate line between what belonged to the public and what belonged only to the very small number of people who had truly lived inside those walls alongside him. But privately, according to people close to her, she became noticeably more reflective in her final years, occasionally hinting to those nearest to her that there were things the wider public simply didn't understand about him. She began speaking more openly, but only with people she fully trusted, about the medications, not in any scandalous tone, but almost clinically, describing precisely how many pills there were, how regularly he took them, and how, even with doctors constantly present in the house, it never quite felt like genuine medical care. It felt, in her own words, more like quiet management than actual help. She never once claimed that he wanted to die. In fact, every single time that idea came up in conversation, she pushed back against it firmly and without hesitation. But she believed, deeply and consistently, that something essential about those final months had been completely misunderstood by the public for nearly half a century. The actual turning point happened almost by accident, during a small, informal gathering near the very end of her life. Someone asked her casually if there was anything she had ever wished she had said publicly about him over all those decades. She paused for a long, heavy moment, and then said something that left the entire room completely frozen. "I don't think he died the way everybody says he did." Not really. She wasn't hinting at any conspiracy. She wasn't suggesting a secret cover-up or some impossible faked death. What she meant was something far more human and ultimately far more tragic than any conspiracy theory could ever be. The simple, repeated story that he had merely collapsed under the combined weight of drugs and poor health completely flattened the reality of a man who was struggling deeply, yes, but who was also quietly planning a very different kind of future, who had spoken, just days before his death, about wanting to start over somewhere far away from everything Graceland had come to represent in his life. In the final months before her own death, she slowly began opening up more than she ever had in the previous 45 years combined. Someone close to her described the experience as watching a person finally exhale after holding their breath for nearly half a century straight. In a small recorded conversation, captured not long before she passed away, her voice noticeably softened by age but still razor-sharp in its memory, she said the words that still send chills through people who hear them today. "He wasn't what people think," she said slowly. "He wasn't some broken man simply waiting around to die. And he didn't go the way everybody has been told for all these years." She described that final morning one more time, but on this occasion with far more emotional weight behind every single word she chose. "He didn't ask for much," she said quietly. "Just water. Not food. Just water. But the way he drank it, like he genuinely hadn't had a drop in days, that detail stuck with me my entire life. He was tired, absolutely. But there was something in his eyes that particular morning, something that looked far more like a man trying to reset himself than a man giving up entirely." And then came the single sentence that silenced everyone in that room completely. "I always told people he was sick. And he genuinely was. But I am telling you right now, he was not ready to go. Not even close to it." She continued, speaking more slowly now, choosing every individual word with visible, deliberate care. "He used to talk about getting away from everything," she explained. "Not from people specifically. From the constant noise surrounding him. From always having to be Elvis Presley every single day of his life. Just about a week before it actually happened, he told me directly, 'I just want to feel like a regular man again. Somewhere quiet, where absolutely nobody knows my name.' That is simply not something a man says when he has already completely given up on his own future." She also revealed a detail almost nobody had ever mentioned publicly before that moment, a small, quiet collection of books he kept upstairs in his private space, many of them focused on spirituality, personal healing, and genuine transformation. He was actively looking for answers, she explained carefully. Not inside pills anymore. He was finally starting to notice just how much of his entire life had been controlled by other people for far too long. She never once pretended that he wasn't genuinely struggling during those final months. He was in real, significant pain, she admitted honestly. People he had trusted deeply had hurt him in ways that mattered. His sleep schedule was a complete mess. His body was clearly worn down from years of heavy medication. "I am not saying he was perfectly fine," she clarified. "I am saying that he was trying. And that distinction matters far more than most people ever realize." Her voice never once rose into anything resembling drama, but every single word she spoke still landed with significant emotional weight. "They say he overdosed," she said plainly. "And in a strict medical sense, maybe that particular detail is technically accurate. But I believe the real underlying truth is simpler and considerably sadder than any headline ever managed to capture properly. I believe he was simply exhausted. Not only in his physical body, in his spirit as well. And that represents a very different, much deeper kind of tired than people assume. He wasn't being reckless that particular morning. He wasn't out of control in any meaningful sense. He simply wanted to sleep, more than anything else in the world." She shared one final memory that day, something she had genuinely never told a single living soul before that exact moment. "A few days before he passed away, he asked me directly if I truly believed people could completely start over, change their entire life from scratch if they really wanted to. I told him honestly, sure, if someone wants it badly enough. And he smiled in this particular way and said, "Maybe I actually will. Maybe one morning I'll simply wake up and walk away from absolutely all of this. Just disappear somewhere quiet and peaceful." He said it like it was half a joke at the time. But part of me has genuinely wondered every single day since then whether he actually meant it. When her words eventually reached a wider audience, they didn't explode across headlines or dominate trending pages overnight. There was no sudden viral news cycle, no dramatic breaking story announced anywhere. Instead, her words spread slowly and quietly, shared within small dedicated fan communities, whispered about at gatherings of long-time collectors who had spent their entire lives studying every single detail of his story with genuine devotion. But those who paid close attention understood almost immediately that this particular account was different from every other rumor that had circulated for nearly 5 decades. This came directly from someone who had genuinely lived inside that house, someone who had personally stood only a few feet away from history on the exact morning it actually happened. Reactions to her words were notably mixed at first. Some longtime fans were moved nearly to tears, saying her account finally helped them understand him not as some distant, untouchable icon frozen in time, but as a real, breathing human being, exhausted, deeply flawed, and still quietly fighting in his own private way until the very end. Others remained skeptical, openly questioning why she would wait so many decades before finally saying anything publicly at all. But even the most committed skeptics couldn't reasonably deny one simple, undeniable fact. She had absolutely nothing to gain from any of it. No documentary deal waiting in the wings. No book tour scheduled. No financial motive driving her words. She simply spoke honestly, and not long afterward, she passed away peacefully, leaving her words hanging in the air like the final unfinished line of a song that only she had ever truly understood completely. Among serious historians who have spent years studying his life, her statement created a much quieter kind of reckoning than any tabloid headline ever could. For nearly half a century, the widely accepted narrative had remained simple and somewhat brutal in its framing. He spiraled out of control. He overdosed tragically. He died far too young because fame ultimately consumed him entirely. But her version never actually contradicted any of the basic established facts of that familiar story. It simply reframed them in a more complete, more human light. Instead of painting him as careless or already completely lost, she suggested instead that he was worn down, certainly, but still deliberate and intentional, a man still actively considering real, meaningful change, someone who hadn't truly given up on life itself so much as he had been completely overwhelmed by its impossible accumulated weight. Inside dedicated fan communities, her words sparked a genuine wave of renewed curiosity about the final months of his life. People began re-watching old footage carefully, studying outtakes from his very last performances frame by frame, searching for any small, previously overlooked sign that he had genuinely been planning something meaningful beyond the walls of that mansion. The central question slowly shifted, almost imperceptibly at first, from simply how did he die towards something far more compelling, what was he actually trying to become before he died? And that subtle shift matters far more than most people initially realize, because it finally leaves room for something the old, familiar story never once allowed. It leaves genuine room for hope. In the end, her quiet, carefully considered confession didn't ignite controversy or manufactured scandal of any kind. It sparked something far closer to genuine compassion across an entire community of devoted fans. It reminded an entire generation that legends are rarely built in a single defining moment, and they don't typically fall apart in one single moment either. Her truth was never loud or sensational in its delivery. It was simply, profoundly human. And in finally choosing to share it before it was too late, she allowed the entire world to remember him not as a man who was completely defeated by his own overwhelming fame, but as someone who, even during his final, exhausted hours on Earth, may have still been quietly reaching for something better, something simpler, something that finally, truly felt like his own.